ABRF meeting sessions is permitted, subject to our speaker's requests not to capture pre-publication information. And then there will be recordings available of the program sessions after the meeting. ABRF social media policy is that everything can be shared. If a speaker asks that it is not to be shared, please respect that speaker and do not post any of that on social media if they do ask. And the hashtag is ABRF 2026. Unless noted, please hold your questions until the end. And then if you haven't already, please download the meeting app. I will also point out that today we have a whole host of equity and inclusion related talks and sessions, including after this, No is a Complete Sentence, How to Be Your Own Advocate in a Service-Oriented Core. So please feel free to check that out. In this space, we will have a luncheon, an equity and inclusion luncheon, where people can network, talk about their own experiences or equity and inclusion efforts more broadly. So please join us here. And then we have our DEI award and presentation directly following. So we will be honoring Dr. Mariana Denise this afternoon. And then lastly today, we will be doing a panel session called Shared Resources, Shared Stories, DEIB Perspectives in Core Facilities. So please, I encourage you to join us throughout the day. And with that, I will introduce our speaker. So I am really excited to welcome Dr. Siegle to the stage today, who's going to talk to us about neurodiversity in science and the science behind that. So please welcome Dr. Siegle to the stage.
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me. It's really exciting to be here with this group who supports so many of our scientists, and to be talking to you about this topic, which frankly, I'm just excited that you would want to hear about. So you know, I am supported by any number of foundations and national sources, and I do hold a patent through the University of Pittsburgh that's licensed by Apollo Neuroscience. I'll discuss some research associated with that patent. Okay, as to who I am, I'm an emotion neuroscientist, and that means I use lots of core facilities. We do a lot of brain scans, so we're using biostatistics, core facilities, patient recruitment, and our scanning of brains has a whole lot of infrastructure behind it. I am a neuromechanistic treatment developer and translationalist. I want to see how we can get research from clinics or from the research labs all the way out to clinics and work to facilitate those pathways. I'm also a lab director and PhD mentor, and what that means is that we're working to translate the findings that we have on how brains work right to the people in our labs. And that's what I'm going to try and talk to you about today, is facilitating science by using our science. So you know I am an autistic, anxious person, and I sometimes get depressed, and I will be talking from that perspective of internal ethnography as well as external science. Let's talk about some of the dimensions that may lead itself to diversity that we could address in our labs and try and use to facilitate thriving. The National Institute of Mental Health did a kind of a neat thing and recast a lot of what we had in the past called symptoms and diagnostic symptoms to be continua. And those continua can facilitate either thriving or vulnerability depending on how you work with them. They identified emotion domains of positive and negative affect. I'm an emotion scientist, so that's what I'll primarily concentrate on. But mostly I want to give you the way I think about this. So we'll also talk about some cognitive, sensory, and social processing domains so you can see how this might apply in other domains as well. My general approach is to meet people where they are and to try and understand the variation of people who are in our research portfolios, in our labs, in the people we support, and its implications. Most of the psychiatric interventions we have, the pharmacologies, the psychotherapies, try and make people more like the average person. that is actually kind of a big, weird lift, especially professionally, because people don't start out as the average person, and not very many people aspire to being the average person. So it's often easier and actually more exciting to capitalize on what people bring and accommodate their needs in ways that facilitate thriving. For each of the dimensions, these RDoC dimensions that I described, let's discuss the phenomenology so we can understand the ways we encounter may vary, just so you can recognize them. Then, because we are scientists, or many of us came from a science background, I want to talk about the neural circuitry and biomolecular mechanisms that got us to these places, and that's how we know to interact with our world. And then we'll talk about, for each domain, facilitating thriving, because we want our labs and our people and the people we support to thrive. Please feel free, if you have clarifying questions, to ask those questions straight up. I will also give the content warning that I'm going to talk very frankly about autism, depression, and trauma. If you need to walk out, that is absolutely fine. If you need to close your eyes, that's fine too. And if things are sensory hard here and you need to go for that reason, all of that is fine. Take care of yourselves. Paths to diversity. There are lots of ways we can get to neurodiversity, and I'm going to use neurodiversity as a very broad term, describing just the ways people can vary. Almost nobody started off as average, so we all have some level of diversity, and these are big, wide umbrellas. Neurodivergence is a term that I will use, describing people who are sort of out at the ends of these spectra in ways that may, on occasion, necessitate some accommodation or support so that people can thrive in the situations we put them in. So we can have developmental neurodiversities, things like autism, ADHD, psychiatric conditions, which I'm going to argue can actually work for us or be vulnerability factors, and culture, and I'll talk about a whole bunch of cross-cultural research today. I'm not going to cover other entries to diversity, like physical differences and hormonal changes. Again, the idea here is just give you the way I think about it, and you can translate that in many ways to the populations you're working with. The psychiatric conditions I will particularly mention because since pandemic, 25% of the people you will encounter will be depressed or anxious. And so it's pretty important that we look at these as people who are in our labs and in our portfolios rather than some other place. I want to start with the domain of emotion reactivity. And we'll talk about the phenomenology of this. We know that emotional style affects performance. This has been around for quite a while. And there is this common expectation that I hear all the time that people's emotional style is fairly uniform in professional environments. It's business-friendly, low-key, and well-regulated. That said, that's not everybody who we will encounter. We have people who are on the higher spectrum of reactivity, often slightly lower regulatory control. This can manifest as enthusiasm and excitement and drive, or it can manifest in ways that are more associated with vulnerability, like frustration and despair and anger. The interesting thing is if you scan people's brains, you can't tell valence. You can tell intensity and arousal, high versus low, but positive and negative are very, very similar. So it's the same kinds of people who tend toward the high drive, high excitement, high enthusiasm, who also tend to be more on the frustrated despair and anger side. And if we squelch one, often we'll squelch the other. These things can drive production or interfere. Higher reactivity is more common in autism, bipolar disorder, anxiety, and also Latino cultures, Latinx cultures often really prize a higher level of reactivity than we often aspire to in the US business culture. In contrast, lower reactivity, also a thing. It can be manifested as a cool or rational head. Same people are often perceived as having blunted emotions, or they may be dissociating. They're not even in the room, especially when you're giving them feedback. Or it may be a lot of masking, and masking means I'm having an internal experience and not showing it on my face, which can be quite effortful. And that effort can manifest as lower performance because I'm spending so much time managing emotions. It can allow dispassionate focus or be hard to read. And these traits are especially common in autism, people who have strong more chronic trauma histories, and a lot of Asian cultures. I actually went and lived in Japan just to study this because my postdocs from Japan said this is very culturally normal there. And I went, and indeed, these are folks where you would lose face if somebody had negative affect on your account. So you work hard not to cause that, which means you're toning down your own negative affect. I asked, can I talk to the people who are the best at that when I was living in Japan? And who are those? And they were like, oh, those are the monks. And they brought in these 25-year-old 25-year monks to my brain scanner in Japan. And we were scanning them as we would hit them in the scanner with wooden mallets and watch as the sensory cortex would register, and then everything would just cut off. It would just be like, yeah, I'm not doing that. I'm not going there. Also, these lower levels of emotionality are common in almost any minoritized culture. As you know, it is not okay in the majority culture for women and black men especially to be angry. And that yields increased emotional labor where people have to work hard just to appear super cool, super rational, so people don't get scared or dismiss them. And that may mean lower performance unless we find ways of allowing that emotionality in our environment. In contrast, the research world does pull for opportunities for some level of reactivity. Our funding's often dubious, stability is often low, there are very few complements in the research world. Contentious interactions, debate is the goal, and for people for whom debate is conflict and creates anterior cingulate activity, which recruits all of our brain structures that go to fight and flight, that can be very trying. Competition is the norm and often the expectation, especially in grant-funded worlds, and nobody is paid to care about you but you in most of research. So if you are somebody who is prone to emotional reactivity, you've got a lot of it potentially coming in this environment. And think about then if you're creating a lab or supporting a lab or supporting a structure with labs, what does that mean for what you want to say to do with folks with higher reactivity if the very infrastructures that we have create opportunities for that? What we have seen, as I mentioned, so much of the population has this higher reactivity. That reactivity is often more sustained in people who are depressed or anxious or prone to depression or anxiety. So these are folks who worry and they ruminate. And what we've shown here is people who are more sad are more prone to worry, no matter how you define it, more prone to rumination. And one of the things I want to mention here is one of these scales is particularly ruminating about solutions. The people who turn over problems over and over in their mind looking for solutions, the thing we want in scientists, that happens more in the people who are higher in depression. So again, is that something we want to select out or select for? That's part of your decision. What I will say is that the brain predisposes us to these kinds of processing. We have a brain network starting with areas like the amygdala, we call it the salience network, that sees things in our world as important. Ideally, it's going to judge something as important, and then prefrontal mechanisms in the front of the head, these newer brain areas, are going to come online and say, okay, yeah, you've made that decision, we can be done. Rather, though, there are more projections from the amygdala up to cortex than there are inhibitory ones from cortex back down to the salience network. What that means, if I show you an emotional word and say, is that relevant to you? People who are not depressed have a little bit of amygdala reactivity. People who do get depressed have more and increased and sustained amygdala reactivity. Take these same people and then have them do a cognitive task. Like, here are 3 digits, put them in order and tell me whether this is the middle digit. The people who are not depressed have more of that prefrontal control, and the depressed people have less of it because the amygdala has come online saying, oh, you needed me to do a thing, I'm going to be emotionally reactive. It may take me a while to bring on cognitive resources. And the people who aren't depressed, there's a lot of this feedback between the prefrontal and salience networks In the people who are depressed, that feedback is weaker, so again, it may take a little while. With folks who come into my lab, what I say when we scan people's brains and see these patterns is, yeah, if someone asks you, could you put this somewhere, you can do it just fine. If someone says, I don't like where you put it, now could you put it this other place, that emotional tone may be what we prioritize and spin on for a while, and the actual cognitive thing may get past, or we may process it a bit later. And that just means owning, yeah, this is how I need to be talked to sometimes. If you need me to do things, keep it a little cognitive. If I get on an emotional place, I may spin for a while. How long does that spinning last? Well, it turns out it's kind of a while. Is it comfortable? No. It turns out that in the brain, emotional pain and physical pain are almost indistinguishable. People actually hurt when they are in emotional pain. That cringe, they did this amazing experiment where they shocked people, and then they actually asked them, they showed them videos of, like, somebody said, this is your friend, and they're about to ask somebody out on a date, and they can see that their zipper is wide open. And that cringe, it was the exact same brain mechanisms as being shocked. We've looked in autism, and in autism you show people emotional words and brain areas that are attending to body things like the insula that does interoception and knows how I'm feeling. Pain responsive areas all come online. How long it lasts. So if you look, for example, at norepinephrine release that is associated with this more agitated high salience network state, norepinephrine release in the vicinity of the amygdala when you shock a rat's foot comes on, and it stays on for the next 4 hours. It doesn't go away when we want it to. This does translate to people. We've looked at, for example, pupillary reactivity. Here are people who are not depressed, not autistic. Here are autistic people with more sustained pupillary reactivity, which is associated with norepinephrine function. And then here are our ruminators, or depressed ruminators, who are really up high and sustained. And how long does it last after that? Well, this is a really sad experiment. This is a rat experiment that I did not do, where you expose a rat to social defeat, one single instance of social defeat. It is no wonder that their body temperature goes up for a few hours and comes down. The time scale on this side, though, is weeks, or is days. And what you can see is the single social defeat here, and this is time spent immobile. 2 weeks, 4 weeks, the rat is spending about half of its time immobile after a single instance of social defeat. These things hit home. And it turns out that it's not just for some people, it's for everyone. It's just sometimes people recover faster. So we expose a lot of people to criticism using a paradigm by Jill Hooley. She's actually pretty sadistic. She calls people's mothers and has people's mothers criticize their kids in the brain scanner and records that. We actually had people generate what their attachment figures would say. But you see, red is activity, blue is deactivation. All you see when people are exposed to criticism is brains shutting off. And it turns out to allow positive feelings, you also need to shut off a lot of these regulatory control. So negative or positive, you have to stop regulating just to experience it, and maybe that's integral. How do people fall out on this? I mentioned that positive and negative processing end up being the same in the brain a lot. We used to think, and the canonical model has been, that valence, or positive and negative information, are represented, for example, on the x-axis, and arousal is on the y-axis, so up here is horrified and ecstatic and vaguely amused and bored. Near as we can tell, it's actually way more of a globe structure, where arousal is longitude lines. Low arousal, these guys are pretty different. Up at high arousal, everything meets up at the North Pole, which is why horrified and ecstatic looks similar so often. Now, for some people, that may be hard to tolerate, and as I mentioned, they may end up shutting down. We've got an emotion donut model for them where they can sort of fall through in the center, and you see people who go stone cold, and they dissociate, and they go out of the room. Often, the thought is, especially in neurodivergent populations, that when things get too much, we have brake mechanisms that keep us from having an utter meltdown or doing really difficult things, and we put a whole lot of brakes on. It's a cortisol-facilitated mechanism. And the thing I would say about that is often to get out of that state. It's way easier to come up through the middle, and you'll see people come out of one of these shutdown states into a bit of an agitated state long before they come back, because coming around the other way would be way longer and harder. Watching for people shutting down may then be useful. People you're talking to, if it looks like they're being receptive, and then you're seeing, oh no, they've got that 1,000-mile stare going on, that may be some level of shutting down, dissociating, opting out. We've shown that it's a lot of the population. And actually, this work was started back in, I would say, 1925 was the first publication I saw on it, where they showed people decks of cards. And this is a fellow named von Restorff would show people decks of cards and say, please remember each card. And one of the cards would have a picture of a naked person on it. And all of a sudden, people didn't remember the cards that were before or after that. It was anterograde and retrograde amnesia around the emotionally evocative image, because our brains just shut that stuff down. We've published last year that we can get these kinds of effects of attentional escape following trauma-relevant information, especially in people who tend to dissociate, who don't have other psychiatric diagnoses. You've probably encountered some of these examples. Cute aggression, it's so cute I want to squeeze it. People who laugh at funerals, this is actually fairly common. Again, because positive and negative information are pretty much the same up at high arousal, and so it's easy to flip between them. I've not ever met anybody for whom telling them, please calm down, works. But if they, for example, drop dinner and everybody laughs about it, that can actually become hysterical very quickly. Make-up sex works. They did another experiment where they looked at orgasm and fear faces, and 80% of people couldn't tell the difference, just because they're represented the same in the brain. Fun, scary works. We go to haunted houses. Terrible, beautiful is a thing that artists aspire to, and we're often compelled by disgusting things. Again, it's so disgusting. Why am I so attracted to it and want to look at it again and again? Same, that approach and avoidance motivation. That means that excitement and being upset can be confused. More description of experienced emotion, more reassurance can be helpful, especially if you're somebody who shows things on your face a little different than other people. A lot of people who are neurodivergent say, yeah, something emotional happens. I'm not showing it on my face typically. It may look very distressing when I'm just interested. So talking to people about this is my happy face, or saying, yeah, let me reassure you, I'm actually interested, even if I look like I'm offline processing, that can help. Or asking somebody what's going on for you without judgment. What does it mean to facilitate thriving in folks who vary in emotional reactivity then? At the high end, that can be a lot of self-doubt, self-recrimination. Things can be too hard. The Yerkes-Dodgson curve was published in a grand total of 8 monkeys were behind this research. But what it said is there are lower levels of arousal can yield optimal function, and even lower levels, you're not even motivated enough to do the work. So how can we help people move their arousal to a place where they can function, get to adaptive levels of worry? If you see somebody worrying so much all the time, we can say, hey, maybe we could take a little longer to think about that. Helping people get optimal self-esteem. There's this concept of flow. Flow is, there's a whole lot of research done by a guy with a very long Eastern European name that I can't pronounce right, but Sint-Mishnihai, I think. And basically what he says is if you help people to stay challenged below their failure threshold, this gets to flow states, where they're working hard, but not so hard they're regularly going to fail. That will keep people's arousal at about an optimal level of performance for them. If they get to where they're failing a lot, That arousal is too high and you'll get to the worry states. If it's too low, they're not going to be motivated. So that as administrators, our goal is to help people to be in these flow states, just enough pressure to perform. How else can we recognize this kind of diversity and respond to it? Understand some people are more and some people are less highly reactive to the same things. And that integrating teams with people who are more and less highly reactive can actually be useful. Spurring teams to integrate diverse perspectives stimulates team synergy. We've known this from business literature for a long time. And it turns out this is not biodemographic diversity. Much as we would like to say that it is, those variables end up having fairly little variance in performance. In contrast, functional background, how people approach problems, integrating people with different levels of functional performance does improve the team's performance and synergy. For people with high emotional reactivity, one temptation would be facilitate people getting treatment if they need it, and certainly some people do. Psychotherapies and pharmacologies actually help with this. At the same time, maybe we could use each person's reactivity. Maya Tamir is an extraordinary researcher out of Israel, Tel Aviv. And she did this experiment where she said to half the people, anger is really terrible for you. It compromises performance. Your physical coordination is compromised. You don't think rationally. And she had them play a video game, and then she made them angry, and they played it again, and they did terribly. The other half the people, she said, anger is the only negative approach emotion. It gives you the power to go out and do. You get laser focused. You actually have so much muscle control because you're able to do things that you wouldn't otherwise do in that state. And she had those people play the video game the second time, and they did way better. It's how you frame the emotions that ends up being how the emotions affect your performance. I have a student, Marlene, and she was writing a K award. And she kept having a lot of negative affect about the topic of her K award, and it would keep her paralyzed and she wouldn't write. Until we said, what if your negative affect is actually the signal? You're sensing problems in the field. What if you write about those problems and what you're going to do about them? Whenever you feel bad, write about what you feel bad about, but in an academic way. And all of a sudden, she wrote a great K award based on, everything's terrible. But NIH bought that she thought things were terrible and she was the one to do something about it. She also then was like, how do I start using that negative affect productively? And one time we were having a really heated discussion about some research, and she was feeling herself starting to shut down. And I saw her starting to do this. I said, Marlene, what is it that's going on for you? What are you doing? She said, what am I doing? I'm doing the ridiculous dance. What do you mean? Well, it's just all so ridiculous. And we're dancing about it. And I started doing this too. And we were dancing and moving and thinking. And all of a sudden we had some of our most inspiring discussions, but it was not something we could sit still for. Learning a person's affective style, responding to it uniquely, means that we can actually work with people. I had a friend who worked at the Pittsburgh Zoo, and she was working in the cafeteria. And you can imagine the level of pressure for lines of small children who are away from home coming in for lunch every day. And one day it became too much. And she started to tear up, and her supervisor came over to her and said, here, I want to show you something. And she brought her down to the loading dock and just said, this is where I go to cry. And she left her. And my friend said that was the best thing somebody could have done. Just give her a space, say this is perfectly okay, we understand this is this kind of environment. And she came up 10 minutes later and continued to serve lunch. We know that social baselines work. This is work by Jim Cohn. He put people in a brain scanner and shocked them because that's what psychologists do, and then threatened to shock them. And he showed that if they're just holding somebody's hand, all the brain reactivity associated with fear goes down. Regulatory structures don't come online. Having the social support actually decreases the fear reactivity in people who are prone to it. Turns out that if you hold somebody's hand, you estimate hills as less steep to walk up. You estimate problems as more solvable. It's just not being alone. And he says we're evolved that way. It's being alone that is the weird social thing that brings out vulnerabilities, not the emotion predisposition itself. How about the people on the low end? How do we facilitate thriving for them? Well, it turns out predictability and trust really work. We took people who had chronic trauma backgrounds and were otherwise hard to spur arousal in, and we gave them an environment of high predictability, told them exactly what would happen, high trust, and said, you get to call the shots here. And all of a sudden, they leaned into whatever experience we gave them and had no trouble with arousal. It wasn't a physiological problem. These were folks who the world was dangerous for, and they had to opt out to survive in it until you created a world with a little more trust. Trust activates the brain's reward circuitry. It helps people sync brains between each other when they have trust to activate regulatory control areas in predicting future behavior. They're going to think things aren't so bad if they have predictability, if they have trust. And as I mentioned, then they can take away some of that over-control. We think dissociation is often over-control. Ruth Lanius is a trauma researcher who shows that the people who are dissociating actually have a ton of prefrontal activity. If you want to let somebody have more positive emotion, be more engaged, they have to shut off some of that over-control, and that may take trust that someone else has my back and I'm not going to be threatened right now. I want to take a little bit of time to talk about emotion perception, not reactivity, but even how you judge the emotion in the room. Again, emotion perception styles affects performance. This one is a little bit complicated. The research is that for women, more emotion perception tends to go toward higher performance. For men, higher emotion perception actually yields worse performance in the workplace. Make of that what you will. But the construct here, perceiving other people's emotions, there are differences. And again, there's this common expectation that we have just enough perception, whatever that means. But people aren't oblivious, they're not uncomfortably insightful. And again, there's variation in the population around that. Higher perception can be perceived as being empathic or compassionate, or same people, you interpret it differently, it's oversensitive. So it can drive production or interfere. It's especially common in people who are autistic, people with borderline personality, and in Japanese culture, it turns out people are very sensitive to tiny little variations in emotion, because again, you're working so hard to manage the emotion in the room on your account. Lower perception, also common. It can be perceived as being very business focused. My wife is in technology. I said to her, what do you do when somebody's crying at their desk? She says, you walk right by and let them cry. You don't engage, you don't ask how they're doing. That would be embarrassing for them. And she's like, the less you're perceiving it, the better it is for everybody. Lets people have space. At the same time, people who are lower in perception may miss cues. Google actually had asked me at one point to help consult for them because so many people's emotion perception was so low in one of their environments, and they wanted to say, how can we increase that reactivity and that perception? And they went hand in hand. This is common in autism, chronic trauma, and US business culture. Turns out that emotion processing mechanisms are differently engaged for different emotions. So we have different brain networks that are associated with perceiving anger and sadness and fear. What that means is some people may be really good at perceiving some emotions and not others. Often autistic people are told, I can't imagine you're autistic, you're so good at perceiving certain emotions. And then others it's a big blind spot for. Different brain networks, not weird. Correlates of emotion perception may also differ among people. So for example, people who tend to be more autistic end up having more of the salience circuitry associated with fear generation when they look at people's eyes. So you often see people who are more neurodivergent looking away from people's eyes. It's interpreted as, oh, you must dislike me, or it's revulsion, or all of that. It turns out that actually it's just if I look at eyes, I might be very scared and it might be painful and I might not be paying attention to what you're actually saying. And so I'm intentional about eye contact to reduce my amygdala activity, which means I can have my prefrontal control online to listen to you. And if you ask people about their style, they'll probably tell you. And it turns out a lot of people just are pretty intentional about it, their eye contact. Turns out that people are also fairly intentional in how they want to manage emotion perception. We know emotion contagion happens. If somebody is showing an emotion on their face, other people tend to end up having that emotion. So in my lab, we have physical and mental health parity. You're allowed to mask up if you don't want people to get any physical thing going on for you. You're also allowed to mask up if you are having an emotion you don't want to be contagious. And half my lab sometimes will come in and just masked up for the day because they say, yeah, my face is a little bit not like I would want to be conveying emotions, and I want you to listen to my words and not what it looks like. We also have the ability for people to work virtually. This is our virtual lab. It's laid out exactly like our physical lab. Anybody who comes in can come into their virtual space and have camera on or off. It decreases urgency for responses. People can take a little extra time to respond. And it turns out people in the group are using LLMs to rephrase things for them. I tried that to just say, could you please word something more diplomatically? And it was pretty good at helping me word things more diplomatically. So just using the external tools we have. There's one topic I was actually asked to speak about, and that is self-disclosure. And with emotion perception, not everybody's going to perceive exactly who we are, what our emotional style is. Not everybody's perceptive to it, and especially if you have people who are not terribly emotionally perceptive all the time, it may help to disclose a little bit more what your style is. That said, that disclosure is a fraught subject, and there's very real stigma for saying I have emotions, or I have emotions that sometimes are not in my control, or that express differently than I would want them to. I would suggest that with 34% of people in this upcoming generation having some level of mental illness, that stigmatizing mental illness is maybe shooting ourselves a little bit in the foot. But again, people understand that it happens. So being sensitive to maybe people don't always want to disclose is a thing. Another one is, how much do people even want emotion? And it turns out people vary completely in how much they want or need emotion or arousal, not being calm. The common expectation is sort of that you prioritize lots of emotion in your life, but definitely not in the workplace. Some people have higher need for emotion and arousal. It's again, interpreted as being empathic and compassionate. Other people have much lower arousal, need for arousal and emotion. This is especially common across Asian cultures. We did the experiment where we recruited people in America. We had some European cohorts that had been published on, and then we went and got 1,000 people in China and looked at need for arousal and emotion. This is how much you approach emotion across cultures. In China, much less emotion approach, even when it's positive, and how much you avoid emotion. And it's negative in American and European cultures. It's not negative for avoiding emotion in China. The reason we were publishing this in BMC Public Health is that we were looking at what incentives people have to do health positive things. And it turns out that the marketing for hearing aids and all sorts of health positive things is still, it will make you happier. And if you have people, entire cultures that do not prioritize emotion, you'll be happier may not be the way to reach people. You may want to reach them in other ways, like saying, this will help you be more connected to your family because you can hear them better, or something like that. But the emotional arguments are not always the ones that work for different people. Brain mechanisms, we believe this is a lot tied up in striatal dopaminergic circuitry associated with reward anticipation. More dopamine sets arousal thresholds. So if you have higher resting dopaminergic tone, you're more easily aroused. How do we facilitate thriving if we know people vary in this then? maybe get a sense for what people's arousal needs and wants are and use that. Turns out misattributed arousal is something that happens and isn't necessarily a bad thing. So they did this experiment where they had people read a getting to know you script, team bonding stuff, right? Turns out they didn't bond very much. They did the exact same experiment with people up on a bridge that was 80 feet in the air swaying and read the exact same script. The people fell in love just reading that getting to know you script because they misattributed the arousal of being swinging in the air for interpersonal connection. If we know that, we can say, yeah, when emotion is in the room, it's going to have effects. We can ignore it and hope it goes away, or we can use it and decide how we want to use it. Facilitate that reward anticipation. When I was in Japan, I was actually working in a group that was being paid by Mitsubishi to study a concept that they have in Japan and not America called wak-wak. And that's the anticipation that good things are just around the corner, that they're about to happen. And Mitsubishi wanted you to think of that when you saw their brand. So we were scanning brains looking for signatures, and that's where I get that it's this striatal dopamine stuff. Have some time. I want to try getting out of the emotion-specific domains, give you a sense of how this may play out in other domains. So cognition, let's take the area of attentional control. Phenomenology, attention has forever been related to a performance. If you want to do a task, you need to actually pay attention to doing that task. And attentional focus has a lot of variation in the population, from hyperfocus, especially common in ADHD, to shifting focus, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes involuntarily. There's this common expectation that people will be sufficiently sustained attention to complete things but not get stuck on tasks. But again, what we have in the population is variation. Higher attention, higher hyperfocus can be highly task-focused, usefully attentive to details, or focused on details in absence of the bigger picture. It can drive production then, or be interfering. It's especially common in autism. Lower attentional focus often can be good or be a vulnerability thing, can breed rapid-fire ideas and diversity of opinions and ideas. It's identified with creativity. It can also be seen as or lead to being unfocused or uncontrolled, often quite common in ADHD. What do we do if we are recruiting people who vary in these dimensions? We can know that it's a brain thing. Prefrontal control, especially areas like the anterior cingulate, are good for mobilizing attention. Prefrontal dopamine signatures are associated with high recruitment of those attentional resources. So again, there's going to be some variation in all of these mechanisms. People manage it clinically in all sorts of ways, but different attentional styles may be desirable. Generative people and slower reactivity, people who take a while to mull things over, turns out you get a lot of optimal group performance if you combine them. You can facilitate dopamine function by making things rewarding or by changing the level of arousal to manipulate attentional control. And some people may need different levels of distraction. Turns out that if somebody needs a whole lot of input, for some people, that input is focusing. We had people come into my lab who were autistic, and we showed them these crazy flashing checkerboards that should be so overwhelming. And some people really, they shut down and said that was way too much. And other people were like, yeah, that's my happy place. And I'm like, what do you even mean? And they said, yeah, when things get bad, I just watch some crazy YouTube video and it focuses me. I need that much input to keep my mind from going to some difficult thing. And actually, if I'm at work, I need headphones on, playing, some really loud, difficult music or something, and that lets me actually focus. Sensory sensitivity is another domain where you'll see intense variation. Some people, and it's related to performance in other domains besides the sensory stuff. So, for example, people who are very attentive to this HVAC noise. I don't know if anybody else has been hearing it the entire time, getting some nods. And that may decrease performance in listening to a given topic. We are expected to be tolerant and reasonably perceptive. But then you have these higher sensitivity people who have higher levels of perception, and that can be resource expensive and it can be painful, especially in more neurodivergent people. Noises, smells, large numbers of stimuli, sounds especially, can lead to increased performance on sensory tasks, but also increased stress in doing them. We're finding that a lot of our autistic people fail to habituate. Again, this HVAC that has just been going the whole time, we should have stopped hearing that long ago, but there it is. It's often present in lots of these developmental neurodivergent conditions. Low sensitivity people, not bothered by their environment, they also may have low sensory perception. Do they even know if the building is burning? You may need both kinds of people around. It's often present in highly engaged, high executive control people. Again, at the extreme end, that being dissociation, where people are using prefrontal cortex to shut down a lot of the sensory input. Nothing's coming in, but then nothing's coming in, and that could be good or bad. We've shown that autistic people are not sensitive generally to just one domain, but it's a lot of domains. They're the high sensitive people, and then these are different domains, and these people are just sensitive to all of the domains. The circuitry for high sensory sensitivity is overlapping a lot with the emotional sensitivity. What folks have shown over and over is that people who are autistic aren't actually hearing sounds at lower levels of decibels. It's just more painful and more attention grabbing for them. And so you see areas that are associated with sensory processing, as well as areas like the insula, which is just body sensitivity. The sensory stuff makes me attend to what's going on inside, maybe at the expense of what's going on outside. It desynchronizes visual cortex processing. You may actually see things funny. I know when I get really highly sensory sensitive, my visual acuity goes down. Maybe some orienting may help. People who ruminate have lower sensory executive integration. So these are highly integrated. And how do we facilitate thriving? You can let people manage their sensory environment. And to give you a super extreme example, Ashley Dukas was a student of mine who took people's cell phones away for 15 minutes because she's that cruel. And she gave them exactly one button to push if they wanted to, and said, this is going to shock you and it's going to be painful if you push that button. It's no wonder that everybody tried it once. What was interesting is how many people kept trying it and kept doing this because they said, I need this just to stay in the room. And these were random New Yorkers. These are not masochists or something, as much as people will guide their sensory experience to allow themselves to exist. So what we've done is say, a lot of times, people need to be more in control and to be able to be back in touch with their bodies in ways that are a little safer. So we took people who were dissociators, whose prefrontal cortex had come on, they had shut out their sensory input, they couldn't even feel themselves breathing. And we said, okay, let's take 100 of these people and give them, and we know that their attention to threat, the external threat, is still high, but their internal processing has gone low. Let's just let them feel vibration synced to their breathing. Gentle, calm vibration. And what happened is that hacked the interoceptive system, and they were able to process the exteroceptive information, which happened to be synced to their breathing. They found that attending to their breathing was safe, and they could come back, and they stopped dissociating. I will let you know that this was a joint study with Pittsburgh and Emory, in Atlanta. The entire population there was Black. This study was funded the week after the black population had a lot of reasons to be very scared about breathing. And they were able to attend to it, and they stopped dissociating, and actually their PTSD went away in 2 weeks of just that. So we've made watches that vibrate just so. There was a group in my lab that took this out and has made a company now that's called Apollo Neuroscience that you can get vibration on demand. And people say they use it to return from shutdown states, they use it to increase focus, they use it to regulate emotions, and it helps them sleep better. And these are people with high levels of trauma histories and PTSD. So letting people guide their sensory environment, I think, could be a good thing. The last one I'll do, and then is social processing, and just say people vary on that too. There's an expectation people will be able to play well with others. We know that people have different levels of social reactivity. Some people have high social need, high extroversion, and those same people often tend to be more rejection sensitive. They have high belonging need. Happens a lot in borderline personality, social anxiety. Other people have lower social processing need, more introverted, lower perception in social environments, idiosyncratic interpretations of social cues, especially autistic people. What do we do with that? We can understand that it comes from known places. If we look at the salience and default networks, that is, say, these brain areas that perceive fear and generate it and that ruminate, highly overlapping with the brain networks that do social processing. So this is the social processing network. Here's that anterior cingulate. Here's this ventromedial prefrontal stuff that is involved in rumination as well as social processing. And then here's the amygdala. We also know that neurohormones like oxytocin are very involved in social processing. It's involved in detection and interpretation of social cues, approach to social behavior, and you should say, oh yeah, that's a good thing. Turns out in nature, oxytocin is the love your partner, hate everybody else chemical. So it's associated with monogamous behavior for that reason. And it increases reactivity to emotional faces. People who take intranasal oxytocin when they're autistic often, if you do it just on occasion, they'll look up and not have pain seeing people's eyes. And at the same time, a lot of people will be more irritated by lots of social interaction. So everything double-edged, and we just need to understand that there is this variation. Understanding what people's social needs are can help. Our social needs are our job needs, so we can actually have that as part of our understanding of how we compose our teams and how we facilitate our science. Understanding social motives for behaviors can help. Working at home is great, except for the people who need somebody else around. I had a student, Ben, who was an exceedingly promising emotion neuroscientist. And at some point, he found that the lab research we were doing just required a whole lot of reading and writing, which he couldn't do with people around. He said, I'm not going to be a researcher. I want to be actually, and he went to supporting scientists rather than being a scientist because it gave him more interaction. And that was his social need, which was what facilitated his performance. There is specific work by Naomi Singer, which tries to differentiate social needs for empathy versus compassion. Empathy is you're having an emotion, so I'm going to go there too, which means you often sink down into the same hole that people are in. And compassion is, oh, you're having an emotion, I can feel for you, I can be compassionate, but I don't have to go down into the hole you're in. And it turns out that therapists often do a lot better with compassion than they do with empathy. And you would say you need high empathy. It turns out that a lot of people actually what they need is higher compassion. So understanding a bit of how we work that way can be useful. I want to take the last few minutes that I talk and just tell you how we implement some of these in my lab, and then spend a little bit of time. We'll have enough time for questions. My lab is devoted to creating a diverse reactivity, people-friendly space by validating each person's emotional style. People in the lab are allowed to cry, very explicitly. They're allowed to get very upset. I have a big lab of very neurodivergent people who, if they weren't, just wouldn't work there. And I did initially, people told me, I I have to work from home because I can't be around people much. And I'm like, you want to try it? What if we make a safe place? And they're trying it. We've encouraged people to say their affective state if they want to, rather than trying to hide it, just so they don't have to do so much mental effort masking. I sometimes wear physiology because my face doesn't belie my actual emotions, so I wear something that shows my skin conductance, and people can know when I'm agitated before I do. It's okay to ask if people aren't okay, but it's also okay not to answer. And it's okay to mask up if you don't want to be seen that way. We try to attend to collaborative dynamics by preparing for our interactions. If we're going to have an emotional discussion, we say, hey, I would like to have a big discussion tomorrow. Can you come in and can we be ready for a big or maybe emotional discussion? Feel free to take some time in the afternoon. I had a colleague who we put in a grant that got scored okay but was not funded. We took it pretty hard, and we're like, we've got to write this grant, but it was so emotional going back to it. So we flew to Oregon, and they have the second highest waterfall in America there, and there's a restaurant halfway up that waterfall. And we hiked up to this restaurant, and we parked in front of the big picture window in front of this waterfall, and we ordered hot chocolate all day long and wrote this grant in that setting. And it created the emotional space for us to actually write the grant, and it got funded. We set our emotional intentions in advance for meetings, empower people to help maintain that emotional tone, say we're going to try and keep this generative, we know this is a critical topic, and send out agenda a lot in advance with tractable goals. People say, with all that emotion, isn't it a toxic environment? And we realize it very easily could be. So we have some toxicity vaccines that we try and keep to, not taking our affect out on other people. You can be upset. Try not to take that out on other people and make them upset. We're encouraged to say if we feel hurt or demotivated by someone, but say it really objectively. Hey, that one hurt a bit. Or yeah, that arrow landed. And we stop and we deal with it when that happens. Though we describe emotions as valid, expressing emotions constantly, we realize is likely not helpful. So we try and consider some trade-off. The worry science is a bit of worry is useful for vigilance. Worrying all the time, likely not useful. There was a lovely study by Michelle, out of Penn State, right here. I forget her last name. But she showed that 99% of worries don't come true in anxious people. And we just try and keep that on the radar is some worry is good, but it doesn't mean all the bad things are going to happen. And we constantly are working in my lab to learn to manage how much expression is helpful as a group and how much is maybe so much that we want to do something about it. We have mentors. My department is fantastic about this. The more senior you get, the idea in our entire, this is the Western Psychiatric Hospital at the University of Pittsburgh, the Department of Psychiatry with 200 faculty, and their idea is the more senior you get, the more mentorship you need, especially in emotional stuff. Paul Pilkonis taught our professional development series, and he said you hire for your weakness, and then he looks right at a number of us and said, for a lot of you, that's going to be social skills. And you want a coordinator who is better at that than you. I had a mentor's mentor in my department for a while with whom I just ran by the social situations in my lab. Well, here's what's going on. And she was like, oh yeah, you're not perceiving this. There's a storm coming that you need to head off. And so just having somebody else for emotional tone was really helping. How it's going so far? I would say lab culture has started to change for the better since we've been doing this in my lab. It takes work not to make it toxic. One person said, the lab is now the place I come to cry and I don't want that, so leaving the lab. And that was fine, it's not for everyone. I'm sometimes reactive, I know that, which I don't love, but we talk about it openly, which means that it's not stigmatized, and there's constant power differential in that. People can feel free to call me out on it and say, hey Greg, this is a little too much, could you tone down now? And we do that, and just make it straight up. part of the conversation. People who select into my lab select into being brave about the environment. We know it's not for everyone, and I have to be okay about that. But if I'm going to study autism and my lab studies autism, and if I'm going to study neurodivergence, it's going to mean you're going to get a lot of neurodivergent people in the lab, and they're going to need an environment where they can do that. All right, take-home messages from today. All of these RDoC domains that we've talked about, emotional, cognitive, social, sensory, are characterized by individual differences which can affect performance. They're associated with fairly well-characterized neural and biomolecular mechanisms, and they are often hard to change, but they can be understood. This understanding can be used to facilitate thriving in ways that we have demonstrated in labs and that is in research and professionally work. To learn more, you can email me directly. If you have questions about this, I do take the questions and I talk to any group who wants to talk about this stuff. It's the service I do. Our Autism Center of Excellence is hard at work on these concepts, and my lab is the program in cognitive affective neuroscience at the University of Pittsburgh. You can see what we do and get in touch with us if you want to. This is not work I could have done alone. I just want to thank a whole bunch of people who had a lot to do with it. I want to specifically thank Wendy DeAndrea, who really introduced me to the idea of blunted and dissociative emotional processing styles as common. Carla Mazevsky, who has really facilitated autism-friendly work environments at Pitt. And yeah, thank you very much. We have about 12 minutes for questions.
If you have questions, please come up and use one of the 2 microphones.
Hi, thank you for the great talk. I very much appreciate it. I think it's very awesome and love learning about it. And I know you said that your department is really great about like stuff like this. Do you have any advice, resources, experience, or how would you just approach it? Like if you wanted to bring this knowledge back to your, like I'm a lab manager, I'm not a director, I'm not like a big wig at the school. Like how would you approach it, or do you have these resources?
Right. So as a lab manager, I would say first in thinking locally, it's my lab manager who is dealing most directly with this stuff. And my lab manager who is charged with creating the emotional tone of the group. So being exceedingly frank, the lab manager gets to say, hey, before the meeting today, I would love us to set our intention for this meeting. What is the emotional tone for it? And just institute little policies like saying, hey, if you're feeling something, feel free to come to me at any time and talk about it, or make an appointment just to talk about stuff that's not productivity, and if you're up for making that available. Wider picture and department-wide, it's a little harder. What I did in my department is I wrote a 2-line email to my chair one day saying, I am autistic faculty in the department. I am not the only one. If at the department's research day you would like somebody to come up and talk about what it means to actually be autistic and be faculty in the department, I'm happy to talk about that and come out to all 200 faculty and talk about my experience on that. And that was just an email that I threw out. It was 2 years later, but he took me up on it, and I addressed the entire faculty about it. So these things can help. I think having frank discussions with your PI and getting on board with your PI and seeing if they will get on board with this can be helpful. Some schools get very scared of it, and other schools are embracing it. The last thing is a lot of schools and a lot of departments have some level of, and you guys can speak to this, some level of DEI centrally, or DEI-focused groups. What they're called is now completely varying. But getting in touch with them, we have a group in our department called REACH, which is basically diversity outreach. And getting in touch with them let me actually understand the lay of the land. One thing they wanted was just, they have like small goals that everybody can get involved in. One, the most fun was, how do we use LLMs to support a neurodiverse population? And we wrote up some guidelines and just gave that out to the school.
Awesome, thank you.
Good luck. Hey there.
Hi, fascinating talk. A lot of people in this room, including me, run core facilities that are customer facing. And I think the initial definition of emotional labor was for people in customer service positions. So like we can't, how do you balance that with, you have to serve your customers, but you also want to have a healthy environment for your employees?
Right, right. So this is a great question. How do you balance not just masking the whole time with creating an environment for people? I am the chair of a DSMB that was brought in to evaluate for a site visit, to evaluate a site last week. And the PI of the site said, let's go around, we'll say names, pronouns, and also tell me what your accommodation needs are. And so like, I'll start. I'm so-and-so, I'm identifying as male, and my kid is sick, and if they text me during this meeting, I am going to take that text. And then just, they make it matter of fact that there's going to be emotions in the room, and there's going to be divergence in different dimensions and diversity in different dimensions in the room, and just make that a matter of fact part of life. What I've been finding is there's a lot of a generational thing. Gen Z is so up for this. They actually expect it. The younger millennials and Gen Z are taking to this like they expect that we're not going to be ignoring the emotions in the room. So I think you're going to have an easier and easier time of it. The other thing I would say is if we're stigmatizing it, so will everybody. If we are not, and we are making this an awareness of diversity be just something that we do, I think it can be contagious. I'm trying to model today what it means for me to be up here and talking to you in a reasonably professional way. But what you've been seeing is I haven't been masking my face too much. I've been, allowing myself to move my hands in the ways that I do. And I don't get stigmatized too much for it. Maybe I bring in enough money for my school that they, feel like that's an okay thing. But I think people will see the level of service you're providing. I don't know if that addresses your question.
Yeah, thanks.
Good.
Thank you so much for sharing this information. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
As you were speaking, it made me think of these kind of traditional methods we learned of personality tests, and this person's an extrovert, and this one's an introvert, and this is a type A.
Yeah.
And I may be phrasing this wrong, but would you consider this like an overlaying component of these simplistic categories, or is it a completely different model to start thinking about?
I love this question because what you're saying is for a long time, especially professional organizations, have attended to individual differences. I think the dimensions along which they have looked at individual differences are often interesting and often do not capture the kinds of variation that leads to frank disruptions in performance. The kinds of dimensions I'm talking about are ones that lead to levels of need for accommodation and disruptions in performance that I feel like if we're not attending to them, it's really at our disservice. So, for example, the introvert-extrovert distinction is very traditional. And when they think of introverts, they're thinking of people who maybe like to work at their desk a little more. They're not thinking of people who are not coming out of their house because they don't want to be in a social environment ever. I'm saying those people also have a bunch to contribute. The other thing is a lot of these personality dimensions were created before we had reasonable neuroscience. I like the RDoC. because it's based in neuroscience. It's based in genetics, molecular mechanisms, and circuitry. So I'm using that as my framework over a lot of these other dimensions that came out factor analytically. One other thing that I will mention based on a lot of the old personality tests, they came from factor analyses, which means rather than some clustering phenomenon. What that means is that you don't have people who actually necessarily neatly fall into any of these dimensions. They're just continual on which people vary. I've been very consciously using categories like borderline personality, like autism, as in we have whole groups of people that really subscribe to this way of information processing that have often pretty stigmatized labels. And so reclaiming that is part of my agenda.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You mentioned the reaction to anger, saying, some people become super performers and some people just becomes paralyzed. Just make me think that in the makeup of a team, you may want a mix of personalities, and
Yeah.
this is absolutely not something that we're looking for when we're interviewing people. So do you have any, is this something that we should learn how to do better?
So that is the business research, is that these functionally diverse teams actually do perform better.
Yeah.
I know some groups are selecting that way. Brown University's undergraduate admissions group is well known for selecting for the community as a whole and not any individual. So today what they need is, and they select on intersectionality. So I need a one-handed tuba player, and I'm going to search for that person to complete my, the profile of people we're looking for.
But we're not trained.
So I would suggest that that's something we can be trained in, and you guys can speak to where to get that training better than me, unfortunately. But if we don't have ways to train people to do that, I would say that's a wide open area for human resources.
Yeah, right. Well, that was my other comment hearing you speak, is like there's so many things that you describe doing with your team that seems, yeah, absolutely, we want to do that, but HR is like, don't do this, no, bad, don't go there.
I have a very interesting relationship, as you can imagine, with both my IRB and HR. And HR kind of gives us a lot of a pass. They know our group continues to bring in a whole lot of money, and that does help. They also know that we don't come to them regularly for all the things. If we were causing trouble for them, that would be one thing. But we're able to exist, we're able to perform, and so they're not telling me how to lead our emotional lives. We say that we're respecting diversity. We say that we are, facilitating performance. And so I would say talk to HR pretty frankly about, here's the things we're hoping to do. How could we do you care?
Yeah.
Near as I could tell, as long as they're not getting sued, a lot of the time they don't care.
Thank you.
All right, let's give Greg another round of applause. And thank you, everybody, for being here today. We are now entering a networking break, so I encourage you to grab your coffee, tea, water, and head to the exhibit hall before we start our next sessions at 10:45.